Welcome back to SAP Long Term Planning. I'm your instructor, Matthew Hunt. We're now getting ready to jump into our third section called Planning Scenarios. Planning Scenarios, what are we going to learn in Planning Scenarios? Lesson number 1, creating and releasing planning scenarios in long-term planning. Number 2, we're going to specifically talk about a special type of long-term planning scenario called gross requirements planning. And I'll get into some of the details later of why it's a little bit special. Third is calculating the plant average stock, and this one I won't be able to show you in the demo, but I can kind of walk you through the steps because the plant that I'm using is, I'll tell you, set up for MRP areas, and when your plant is set up for MRP areas, you can't use the plant average stock as the initial stock in the long-term planning. But I'll show you how to do it in case you have the situation where you can use that. The SAP menu path that we will be mostly in is logistics, production planning, long-term planning, and scenario. The transaction codes will be using MS31 to create a scenario, MS32 to change a scenario, MS33 to display the scenario, and MS29 is that special average plant stock report that I told you I am not going to be able to run, but I will show it to you. Now I will preface this with when we get to the changing of scenarios. Once you create a scenario, you can change it up until the point that you release and save it. Once you release and save it, it's a little bit more challenging to change it. You would first have to delete all of the data that is tied to it, and then once you've done all that and you've reversed the release, then you can actually change it again. So very rarely, especially with long-term planning and it being simulation, very rarely do we ever do a change or do we even reverse it. It's usually much easier to just create a new planning scenario than it is to try to reverse one and change it. So creating release scenarios, what is the use for this? A planning scenario defines the settings for long-term planning and controls the outcome of the plan. So this is really in a nutshell, the configuration that tells long-term planning what to do. The master data will still come in from the material master and the inventory levels, and it'll be the same data as what you're using for your operational plan. But the scenarios give you the ability to pick and choose what operational MRP elements you bring in. For example, maybe you don't want to bring in a planning time fence, or maybe you don't want to bring in unfirmed planned orders or firm planned orders. Within the scenarios I'll show you, you have the ability to control that. A prerequisite to creating release scenarios is you must have created a planned independent requirements version first. So we already did that in the previous video. We created version S1 and S2. And so those versions are out there, and we'll use those versions in our demo now when we are creating the scenarios. Some features, and there's a lot of them because there's a lot of options within the scenarios, and I want to walk through each one and talk about what each one does. And so the first thing you will do when you create your scenario is you will assign planned independent requirements versions to it. And you can create multiple ones, or you can create just, or you can tie multiple versions to it, or you can do a single version. The next thing you do is you'll assign a plant to your long-term planning scenario, and you can assign, once again, you can assign multiple plants to it. So for instance, where I work, I've actually got a long-term planning scenario going right now with every single manufacturing plant, and it deals with annual budgeting. And so I want to use the same long-term planning for every plant so that when we do our annual budgeting every year. Every plant is planned the exact same way. You'll define the planning periods, so all planned independent requirements in this period are planned. So if you specifically want to plan a shorter period than what your planned independent requirements are, you could choose a shorter period versus bringing in all the planned independent requirements. If you don't enter a period, though, long-term planning automatically starts the planning run at the current date and continues on through the end of the planned independent requirements horizon. Some more features, so continue with the features. Defining the initial stock level. So based on the scenario, you will have a different reason for wanting to change what the stock level is. I'll tell you ahead of time, and I'll talk about this when we get more specific into gross planning or gross requirements planning. Gross requirements planning will specifically always start with the safety stock as the balance on hand. And the reason being is because if you do have a safety stock out there and you're planning way out in the future for like annual planning, you don't want to take that safety stock into consideration. So if you make the initial stock the safety stock, when long-term planning runs, it'll just cancel the safety stock out. The safety stock will be consumed. The safety stock will consume the initial stock, and it's as if you started with zero stock in that situation. As opposed to, there is an option to actually start with zero stock, but the problem with that is if you start with zero stock and you have a safety stock, then you are immediately in the hole inventory-wise when the planning run starts. And so the first thing that long-term planning is going to do is it's going to try to create a receipt to replenish your safety stock. Define if long-term planning is also to create simulated requirements for non-MRP materials. So this would be like if you have a Kanban material or you have consumption-based materials like reorder point planning materials and you want those requirements brought into the plan, you would have to check that checkbox. Define if sales orders are to be taken into account in long-term planning. So if you're doing a short-term plan and you're basing it off of operations, you may want to bring in those sales orders because in the short term, sales orders are impacting your plan, right? Like if you don't have enough stock to cover your sales orders, you need to build more stock. In the long term, though, you may not want sales orders taken into consideration. So that's why if this is a scenario where you're looking more at the long term, you may not want to have sales orders brought in. Control of whether the time fence is used or not. So if you're using a time fence in your operational plan, you may or may not want to have those same time fence restrictions or guardrails put up in your long-term planning. That can be controlled in the scenario whether time fence is brought in from the operational plan. Set up for specific settings for gross requirements planning. I'm going to skip that one because in the next slide I will specifically talk about those. Number 9, define which receipts, if any, from the operational plan are taken into account. So firmed receipts, so any type of purchase orders, schedule agreements that you've got firmed out there that you want to bring those firmed receipts in. Firmed purchase requisitions. You could bring firm purchase requisitions in. Determination of an alternate BOM for long-term planning. So one of the really cool things about long-term planning is it allows you to bring in an alternate BOM. Okay, so you may have a specific BOM out there just for long-term planning, and I'll give you the scenario that I typically have when I have an alternate BOM for long-term planning. It's usually with my annual planning, my end-of-year annual planning. And so at an executive level, they don't want to budget for every single raw material, or there may be some phantom assemblies in my BOM that they don't want. And so they will create a special long-term planning BOM that doesn't have some raw material commodities or phantom assemblies in it. And I'll load that into the scenario when I do the annual planning, and it'll actually, when long-term planning run explodes the bomb, it'll choose the alternate bomb. And when we get into the long-term planning scenario, I will do a scenario specifically with an alternate bomb, and I'll actually show you how it's not using the standard bomb, but the alternate long-term planning bomb. Define an available capacity version to be used in long-term planning. I won't specifically go into a lot of detail here because actually there's a course out in the Michaels Management course catalog already for capacity planning that's really good, and I don't want to be redundant in my lessons here. I will show you how you can get to the capacity leveling screens from within the long-term planning tool, but I won't actually do a capacity plan. So the first screen that I come to in all my demos is always the SAP menu path, and the menu that we'll go into is logistics, production, production planning, long-term planning, and scenarios, and then I've got create, change, and display underneath that. The next screen that we'll get into is the actual scenarios, and all the features that I just talked about, those are these options that you're going to see here as checkboxes or toggle switches and stuff. I do want to, before we jump into the scenarios, talk specifically about gross requirements planning, because there are some special features in the scenario just for gross requirements planning. So why is it so special? Typically, gross requirements planning is used for like high-level budgetary reasons, or if you don't want the net calculation to actually, take, for example, inventory into consideration. You want a one-for-one. Every requirement that I'm asking for, I've got a receipt out there for. And so the two options that you have, switch off scrap calculation, because if you have any scrap set up in your operational plan, you know that will add to your receipts. And so again, we want a one-for-one requirements quantity to receipts quantity, so that's why we're switching off any scrap calculation. The other thing is you may want to use a specific lot size for gross requirements planning. So for example, if you're using maybe a period lot size, or maybe one of the special lot sizes, any type of rounding values or anything like that, gross requirements planning, you don't typically want that. Like I said, you want an exact one-for-one with the requirements. So this is an opportunity to actually use a different lot size than the operational lot size. Okay, I'm going to jump into the demo real quick now. Let me get into my SAP client here. And so, as I said, we're in logistics, production planning, long-term planning, and scenario. I'm going to go into the create, and I am going to create version 905, and I'm going to call it gross requirements scenario. And the nice thing about it is it gives you some radio buttons here on this first screen, and it'll give you predefined configuration. And so since I'm doing gross requirements, I'm going to choose the gross requirements long-term plan, and when I hit the enter button, you'll see it's actually done some configuration already for me based on how gross requirements is typically operated. I can still go in here and I can remove any checkboxes if I don't want a checkbox on there, or change maybe my opening stock. But I'm going to leave everything set to how it is, because this is the typical scenario for gross requirements. First thing you have to do is you have to go into the planned independent requirements, and you have to tie the planned independent requirements version to the long-term planning scenario. So you hit new entry. We created version S1 in the previous section, and so I'm going to now say confirm, And now if I go in there again and I see simulation version 1 has been tied to this scenario. The next thing you have to do is you have to tie all the plants that you want to this version or this scenario. So I'm going to go into the plants button and I'm going to add my plant to it. And this is where I was telling you you can add multiple plants to it. I just added one, but you could keep hitting the plus button and it would keep asking you for more to add more plants. If I wanted to do a shorter period than what my plan independence requirements have, I could enter a different range in here. I've already talked about all of these options. These were the options that I went through in the features section. The bomb selection ID, so this is where you would pick an alternate bomb if I had an alternate bomb out there. And I'll show you the special usage for long-term planning I set up as 09. And when I get into that section, I'll go into more detail, but I would choose 09 or bomb version 09 here. Capacity, if you've got capacity already set up, you could go out there and you could get your capacity profile and bring it in here. So I could bring in the normal version 01 and it would do capacity planning in my long-term planning scenario. So at this point, if my configuration settings are how I want them, I will hit this release and save button. If they're not, I could just hit the normal save button here and that would save it, and I could then come in here and change it. As long as I haven't done the release and save, I can change anything. Once I do the release and save option though, this is where I said I can no longer come in here and make changes. The only thing I can do with a release and save is change the planned independent requirements version. So I'm going to do the release and save now. And when I do this, what it's actually doing behind the scenes is it's creating a planning file entry. And it's going to say, do you want to do this in the foreground or the background? I have a very small bill of materials, so I'm going to do it in the foreground. You may want to use it. You may want to do this in the background if you have a large number of materials in your plant that you're doing this for. So it's done, and what it's telling me is it's created a planning file for 1066 materials against planning scenario 905. So if you're familiar with MRP operational planning, you know that a planning file has to be created before you can run MRP. Long-term planning is exactly the same way. There is a planning file entry out there. It's unique to the planning scenario. So if I created another planning scenario, I would have to release and save it, and it would create planning file entries for that scenario also. But that has been created now, and actually as a test, if you want to go into the evaluation screen for long-term planning, which is MS04, and you put in your planning scenario and your material, so production 01 and my plant 3000, and I go in here, I can now actually see my independent requirements that I've created. So this is coming directly from that planned independent requirements that we created S1. I have not actually executed long-term planning yet. This is just the requirements, so you don't see any receipts here yet. But if you see your independent requirements here, you know that your planning file entries have been created and you are ready to execute long-term planning. So I'm going to pause there, and I'll remind you that after every section there is a quiz, so hopefully you've been taking notes. And when we come back on the next video, we will actually get into creating long-term planning. We'll actually do the run. And you know what? Actually, I forgot one more thing that I want to show you here. So calculating average plant stock. So there's an option in the scenario Let me open my scenario here. So opening stock, if you chose the option of the opening stock to be the average plant stock from the material master record, if you choose that, you actually have to run a separate report after you create the scenario. And I got to remember where it is. Here it is, MS29, average plant stock. And so, as I said in the beginning, I can't actually do this because my plant is tied to MRP areas. So if I try to run this, it's actually going to give me an error. But if you are using average stock as your opening stock, you would have to run this report before you execute the long-term planning. Otherwise, the material master isn't going to have the average stock. Okay, now I am done with this lesson. So I'm looking forward to coming back with you and actually executing the long-term planning run.